Greetings, everyone. I'm happy to be able to speak with you, though I wish it were in person. And I've listed my affiliations for what that's worth. And I just want to give everyone a way to connect with me if you'd like to. You may text me at my phone number, and the country code is 01. And you may email me, you may fax me. I have nothing to disclose, and I intend to assail you with my amateur photography as we go through this presentation so that you'll be able to see a few items from my life. This is my wife, Barbara, at one of our favorite thrift shops in Najac, France. Here's a castle for sale if anybody's interested, though not by me. It was built in the 14th century to protect the copper mines around Najac, which is a place we go every year for a narrative medicine and healing conference. So I'm grateful to Elder Albert Marshall for having originated and developed the concept of two-eyed seeing. Albert is a Wabanaki elder from the Mi'kmaq tribe, particularly from Eskasoni First Nation in Nova Scotia, Canada. And I'm grateful to the original people of the land from where I speak, the Wabanaki people, which Wabanaki means people of the whiteness, which is translated as people of the dawn. And I serve as the medical director for Wabanaki Public Health and Wellness. And so I'm connected with the people of the dawn, though I am not one of them. And I'm also grateful to those who are listening and who have invited me to speak. So, what does it mean to decolonize medicine? Well, when I got to medical school and I was lucky enough to be admitted to Stanford University, I encountered something quite different from the indigenous traditions in which I had grown up. And really, my story of understanding the non-indigenous perspective on health, emotional well-being, mental illness, all of these things began here. And it was quite different, as I mentioned, from what I expected. And it's only been actually in this year that I've come to really understand how it's different. And I like to tell the story, which I've told in my book, Coyote Medicine, about my shock when I sat in pharmacology class and the professor announced to us that life was a relentless progression toward death, disease, and decay. And the physician's job was to slow the rate of decline. Now, speaking to you from today, many years later, I can understand better his perspective, but it was so different from how my great-grandmother and grandmother saw health as a dynamic balance among all aspects of the person that I was quite shocked, and I ran across campus as soon as class ended to the Stanford Indian Center, burst through the door, came upon Henrietta Blue Eyes at the desk, the reception desk, and I said to her, "Henrietta, I need an elder." And she pulled out her Rolodex, which of course no longer exists, except in museums, and asked me what tribe. And I said, Cherokee. And she had two names for me immediately. And I visited one of these elders by the following weekend. So, what is it that we're trying to decolonize? What one of the things that I've learned is that philosophy matters. And I didn't always know that, but it turns out that how we see the world or our philosophy guides just about everything we do. And in Indigenous terms, we would talk about a philosophy as a collection of stories about the world. And we would say that the stories that you have guide what you do. They not only do they guide what you do, but they guide your perception of how to see the world and how to understand what you do. And so this year, with the help of a book called The Mushroom at the End of the World by Singh, I've come to understand this project of modern medicine as a kind of modernist capitalistic enterprise in which visits and procedures are commodified and valuated, and we know that a heart cath is assigned a higher value than a preventive medicine visit by a geriatrician. And similar to the art world, or similar to Singh's writing about Matsutake mushroom, it's somewhat arbitrary, the valuation that we put on things. And it comes back to a value system. And the value system is implicit within capitalism, that value system enables us to assign a monetary value to what we do in the world. And so as I wondered, why am I so uncomfortable with contemporary medicine? Singh's image of the plantation came to my mind. And she draws as metaphor the sugarcane plantations of the Caribbean islands. So when Europeans conquered the Caribbean islands and installed sugarcane plantation, they wanted scalability, which means they wanted homogeneity. So any worker should be interchangeable with any other worker. And in what Singh, and I presume Marx, calls alienation of labor, the workers should gain no benefit from the efforts of their labor besides a salary. So they don't get to accumulate capital. Only capitalists get to accumulate capital, only the owners. And so what they created was one species of sugarcane that this project of modernistic capitalism eliminates diversity, and it eliminates relationship, and it instead substitutes alienation and interchangeability and homogeneity of product or process, and in terms of scalability. So when those requirements are met, one can grow a practice or a hospital to any size, and it still functions in the same way. And this is, of course, in the service of increasing profit. So how does that relate to what we do in medicine? Well, in case you haven't noticed, the movement has been to replace individualized medicine or patient-centered medicine, which many of us say we like, with guidelines and algorithms. So if you have guidelines and algorithms, any practitioner will do. All practitioners become interchangeable. And, and if patients are seen as their collection of illnesses and not as a human being, then relationships are unnecessary because we simply match the diagnosis with the algorithm, and there we have it, treatment. And anyone can do it. So providers, as we're called these days, become interchangeable. I remember in one hospital in which I worked, we were called service delivery units. So what is the product of modernist medicine? It's to eliminate relationship, individuality, particularity, and to substitute guidelines, algorithms, and interchangeability. And when we do that, in the perception of the capitalists, then the person of the doctor and the person of the patient no longer matters. And all that's important is that we have a diagnosis and we have an algorithm for treating that diagnosis. And in fact, the treatment algorithms privilege pharmaceuticals, which are the most profitable treatments because they can be mass delivered and prescribed with a minimum of time on a large scale. So what if relationship is healing? Well, it's not scalable. It's not profitable. It's not nearly as useful to capitalism as pills, medications. And I've learned that we tend to prefer the most expensive medications, regardless of whether they work better or not. And it's just in our, you might say, genes. So why do we want to decolonize medicine? Because it actually doesn't work as well as indigenous medicine or indigenous healthcare for the business of life. Now, what does modernist capitalist medicine work well for? Well, I suppose we could say joint replacement. That seems to be an incredibly successful, profitable enterprise that works. We could speak to coronary artery bypasses or stenting of arteries in the heart, but actually these procedures have not prolonged life at all, though they have improved quality of life, one does argue. But what about the bulk of what some researchers at the University of Pittsburgh call sedentary death diseases, diabetes, things like that? Conditional upon surviving to age 5, our lifespan is no greater today in the United States than it was in 1905. It appears to be greater because many more children died from birth to age 5 at the turn of the century than today. But have we made progress in medicine? Perhaps. Have we lost ground in lifestyle? I'm pretty sure we have since 1905. I don't think they had processed food in 1905. I think people walked where they needed to go in 1905. I think people were much more active, and they certainly didn't have video games. So I wanted just to tell a little story I'm showing you pictures as we go about our ceremonial space here in Indigenous North America. This is an Inipi Kaga. And so we heat stones in this pit. Seems bigger than it is because of the angle of the camera. And when they're hot, we bring them into this structure and put them in a pit in the middle. And we pour water on the stones and we sing and we pray and we do what's called doctoring. It's a terrible word, actually. There's no good translations. There's no good English words for this sort of combination of prayer, healing, energy medicine that happens in indigenous cultures. But this is Inipi. Inipi means they breathe. Ini is to breathe. P is the third person plural ending. Kaga means ceremony. And so it's a they breathe ceremony. And what do they breathe? They breathe the vapors that come off the stones. And these vapors are healing. These vapors revitalize one. And so the best translation would be a revitalization ceremony, though the Jesuits called it a sweat lodge. Though we're fighting against that translation because we're told by elders that it's not really sweat, but toxins that come off the body. And that what we're in there for is to revitalize or to breathe. So the first time that I went to one of these ceremonies, it was still illegal. All of our ceremonies were illegal in the United States until 1978. And so Father Stone was the Catholic priest on the reservation. And he was there at the ceremony with his collar in case the police arrived. And if they appeared, his plan was to put on his collar and declare what we were doing a proper Roman Catholic ritual and to send the police away. And the police did not come, thankfully, but Father Stone shared with me that he liked these ways, and perhaps better than his ways, though he was engaged in two-eyed religion. He was practicing both spiritualities. And in fact, many people went to his masses because he went to their ceremonies. So, so that mattered. And what about our friend Becky, who healed from pancreatic cancer almost 20 years ago when she was told at the Indian Health Service hospital to go home and die, or to go home and get her affairs in order because she was dying. How do we explain that? It doesn't explain well in modernist medicine because it's particular and individual to Becky. It's not reproducible. There's no algorithm. Her healing was a mysterious result of prayer and energy medicine and intention in the context of the Native American Church, which holds its meetings, all night meetings in teepees, such as the one you're looking at. And so for modernist capitalist medicine, if it can't be commodified, if it can't be turned into a sellable product, something that behaves the same every time in every way, then we declare it non-existent. We ignore it. It's completely ignored because it's anomalous. It's not marketable. You can't market Native American Church because you can't control the outcome. You don't know when the spirits will come and do a healing and when they won't. It's a great mystery. And so it's a terrible situation for capitalism. Here's a picture from inside the Native American church. And this is a kind of interesting amalgam of, of spiritualities that arose in the late 19th century as a combination of Christianity and traditional indigenous spirituality. And so the songs are in Northern Cheyenne language, and everything in the ceremony can be converted into what looks like a cooking utensil if the police show up. So there's a fire in the middle, and there are these water drums. And if the police came, the people would pull the top off the water drums, and it would look like a pot of water. And they would stir the water with their long stick fans. So they would appear to be cooking together in a circle if the police appeared. So I want to address to some degree, then, what is indigenous psychiatry or medicine? And we know that indigenous people have been concerned with mental health for thousands of years. And I would argue that people before conquest were much more mentally healthy than Europeans. Life was less stressful than it was in Europe. That, especially in Maine, food was plentiful. That there are stories from when the explorers first arrived that the fish would literally jump into your canoe. It was amazingly easy to survive. And there were large herds of moose, and there were plenty of bear and deer for the taking. And fiddlehead ferns in the springtime, and berries in the summer, and root vegetables in the fall. The Wabanaki cuisine was marvelous. And people did not have to spend that much time gathering and hunting food as they do today. So biomedical psychiatry and medicine dismiss indigenous thought as unscientific and lacking in evidence. And this is what we want to challenge. And Albert Marshall created this term, two-eyed seeing, to present to the world the notion that indigenous healing, indigenous knowledge is just as valid as contemporary scientific knowledge. And of course, Albert was speaking for indigenous North Americans, but I think this perspective holds for any marginalized population, people who hear voices, immigrants, the homeless, whatever. So the word in Mi'kmaq, the Mi'kmaq language, is Eptuaptamunk, and which Albert translates as two-eyed seeing. And as I said, two-eyed seeing helps us to elevate the wisdom of the indigenous world to the same validity as contemporary scientific approaches. And when you think about the results of Eurocentric philosophy in terms of global warming and slavery and planetary conquest, well, it's possible that indigenous wisdom may be necessary for human survival, that we may need to think more like forests and less like capitalists. So what do I mean by that? So in the forest, trees, animals, insects, fungi are collaborative. The trees connect with each other through the root systems. The trees share nutrients with each other through this interconnected web of nourishing. And if a tree is lacking, the trees who have plenty will send their largesse to the tree that is lacking. And in the midst of this are the fungi. And the fungi collaborate with the trees to convert material, rocks even, into nutrition for the trees. And then why don't we throw in some rhizomes, which provide the nitrogen and some of the other necessary materials for growth of the forests. And the trees have recruited and mobilized a veritable army of squirrels and chipmunks to spread their seeds, to take the nuts all over the place. And squirrels have amazing memories. But even they can only remember about 80% of the places where they put their nuts. And so the trees thrive. And Indigenous people observed this and understood ecology thousands of years before the word was invented in English-speaking countries. And we may need this kind of awareness. We may need to be more collaborative and less competitive in order to survive. Because what if competition ultimately results in death to everyone, as opposed to collaboration, which allows us to survive? So Albert's perspective of Eptuoptimunk is that we leave the world a better place. Related to Eptuoptimunk is another Mi'kmaq word, Natukalimk, and it's the idea that human two-leggeds are interdependent and interconnected with the natural and the spiritual world, and that they are embedded in the context of community. So if we approach the world from the standpoint of Natukalimk, then we know that anything we do affects everything else, and that we can't escape that. We can't isolate one thing or another thing. There's no independent variables. There's only interdependent variables. And in this respect, there's a developing literature on indigenous methodologies. And there's even a book written on indigenous statistics, which I have yet to read since I just discovered it 2 days ago. But it should prove to be fascinating. And of course, there's Rebecca Sinclair's work on indigenous logic, which you can find on, well, you can Scholar Google Rebecca Sinclair, or you can listen to the Howling Coyote podcast from October 16th, in which I interview Rebecca about indigenous logic. And just to reiterate, there's no income to anyone from the Howling Coyote podcast. So, there may be some value to indigenous knowledge systems, more so than just allowing ethical space for indigenous people to coexist with Eurocentric thinkers. And so I've mentioned what indigenous philosophy is not. It's not positivism. Positivism says there's one cause and the contemporary scientific method will find it. it says that there's only one best explanation, and that explanations exclude each other, such that a full explanation of an event precludes any other full explanation of that event. And Indigenous philosophy says, well, there's multiple explanations and all are valid, and they need not relate to each other. They, in fact, may contradict each other. So a premise of Indigenous philosophy is that proposition A and proposition not A can coexist and both be true at the same time, which goes against the laws of classical logic. So Indigenous philosophy is not reductionistic. It does not believe that the smallest theory is the best theory. And it is pluralistic. So if all explanations are true and good, then how do we decide which one to use? Well, we choose the one that works. And what if several work? Well, then we pick the one that's the most aesthetic to us. And that's how we proceed. That rather than arguing for truth, we argue for practicality. And so we are, in fact, as in Indigenous philosophy, more than the sum total of all the behavior of our nerve cells and their associated molecules. And so we are more than the sum of our parts. You're getting to see some nice photos of Maine at this point. And so what if people really do know something about how they can get well? What if their illness narrative and their healing narratives matter? That we don't just apply one size fits all algorithms onto people, but we collaborate like the mushrooms and the trees to find an approach that works. And in doing that, we individualize treatment in the sense of finding what will restore harmony and balance for that person who's different from every other person, that we all occupy a different part of grandmother spider's web. And so, so this is about decolonization. And this is, by the way, me with the mayor of Verdenberg, Denmark, on the evening of the lighting of the Christmas tree, which was a great pleasure to attend. And so in Denmark, this is the home of our friends in Denmark. Every kitchen has some trolls, and there they are at the end of the table. So Denmark has not been completely colonized. The trolls still exist, if only in the kitchen. And so what we're talking about is bringing some of the mystery back into healthcare, bringing some of the invisibility back into healthcare. Spirituality is another word for the invisibles. And recognizing that the cultures that do these things are not necessarily inferior. So, so in mental health, what does that mean? It means that relationship may be more important than drugs. In virtually all of the psychotherapy studies, quality of relationship claims the lion's share of the variants. And let's think a little bit about how psychiatry classifies things. So psychiatry works in the same way as botany. Psychiatry has a sort of a taxonomy, a list of checkboxes. And so if 6 of the checkboxes are marked, then a diagnosis is proclaimed. Similarly, in plant classification, if a plant has, let's say, 7 prongs and pointed ends and all the various things that plants are similar about, it gets assigned to a particular classification. But it turns out if we look at the philosophy of biology, this was invented in Europe to facilitate storage of specimens in museums. It has no basis in reality. It's entirely a social construction, the taxonomy of plants. In fact, species are continually evolving. So speciation is a verb and not a noun. And it turns out that now we think that there's 4 species of elephants instead of 2. And um, so so if speciation is a verb, then perhaps psychiatric diagnoses are verbs instead of nouns, and perhaps they're processes. And this fits well, by the way, with research domain criteria for thinking about psychiatric diagnostics, because it looks at a process that unfolds through the course of development. And so decolonization means changing our language and understanding that people are embedded in community and that people are not isolated biochemical closed systems. People are open systems interconnected with other humans and animals, plants, air, water, community in the context of an environment. And so psychiatry has othered people, has turned them into pathological specimens. And what we wish to do is to disother them, is to return them to the realm of the human, and to understand that their process of suffering is an ongoing process that has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and that we join with them somewhere along that process to work together to change the ending, to change the trajectory of where they're going. And that this is what decolonization means. It is not anti-medication. It's not anti-psychiatry, but it's anti-modernism. It's saying that let's undo alienation and let's reprivilege relationship, and let's find a way for people to rejoin us, for the humanness of people to come back, and for the connectedness of people to reemerge. And let's not be slaves to algorithms. And so, how do we do that? Through story work is one of the ways that Indigenous people manage relationships. And stories nourish knowledge systems and our knowledge systems. And this is a marvelous book by Joanne Archibald, Indigenous Story Work. And so stories are powerful, and stories help us to know who we are and how to relate. And that we're not born as who we will become as adults, that this is a process of development. And we're born into a network of stories that influence our trajectory, that cause us to grow in certain ways. And so we're co-constructed by the relationships into which we're born and the stories that exist in those relationships. There's a Lakota concept that I find quite helpful, which is the Nagi. The Nagi consists of all the things that influence us. And you can think of the Nagi as a swarm of all those things that have or will or are influencing us, a swarm around the physical body. And each element in that swarm has a spark of the being who contributed to that swarm. So Indigenous medicine and psychiatry takes place within a community that we don't exist outside of community. And it's modernist philosophy, modernist capitalist philosophy that divides us and individualizes us and eliminates the importance of interconnectedness and relationship. And it's that we need to oppose. So harmony and balance, circular knowledge, that all conditions, and I should say that Indigenous thinking does not separate mind, body, spirit, the way Eurocentric philosophies do. So it wouldn't make sense to talk about a physical illness or a psychiatric illness separately, that we are simultaneously physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual, embedded in community, embedded in a natural world of humans and animals and all kinds of other things. And so Indigenous philosophy never had the mind-body problem because Indigenous philosophy never separated mind from body. So mind is embodied and bodies are embedded in communities, and spirit is present in all matter. The distinction in Lakota is whether or not it moves itself or something else has to move it, as opposed to living or non-living. So all beings, all entities are living. Some move themselves and some must be moved by others. It depends in which it is, changes how you conjugate the verb. So verb conjugation is different for things that move themselves versus things that don't. And I'm particularly intrigued by the word for creator, which is dakushkashka. And what it literally means is that whitest of the white, that white plural, non-moving itself. So that white plural not moving by itself is the word for creator, which is an intriguing meditation possibility, opportunity to think about that. Now, white in Wabanaki refers to the dawn, and in Lakota it refers to the sky. So very interesting possibilities for philosophy. But so another aspect of Indigenous philosophy is the notion of it's non-hierarchical. So it's medicine is extremely hierarchical. There's the chair of medicine, the professor of medicine, the associate professor, the assistant professor, the instructor, the postdoc, the fellow, I suppose we call them, the residents, the third-year resident, the second-year resident, the first-year resident, the medical students. Somewhere in there, we have nurses. Nurses have their own hierarchies. There's the vice president of nursing, the head nurse for the hospital, the head nurse for each unit, and it's all about hierarchy. There's a hegemony that is organized, and the patient is often at the bottom of that hegemony. So what is Indigenous medicine? How is Indigenous medicine different? It's less hierarchical. So people who do healing work, and most of them don't want to be called healers. They want to be called, in Lakota country, they want to be called fix-it people. If you had to make an English translation, there's a song, Lakota song, Pia Waka Waing Tacha, and it really means reparation, repairing people, or not even necessarily people, but repairing in some larger sense. And you could say that repairing is restoring harmony and balance. The word healing in Old English, holon, meant to make whole again. And so these individuals, these elders are much respected, but not put on pedestals in the same way that Western medicine works, that they're part of the community. And in conventional medicine, we're discouraged from being part of the community of the patients that we treat. It's considered a boundary violation to be part of a community. And yet in Indigenous country, I mean, that was the norm. And it was, of course, the norm in medicine until probably the Second World War. Doctors lived in communities and were involved with their patients in multiple ways besides doctoring. And so Indigenous philosophy is non-hierarchical, non-hegemonic. So it's very non-capitalist, because if you don't create status and privilege, you don't have people who are valued more than other people. So we have this marvelous metaphor of the horizon, which is the medicine circle. And medicine could also be translated as powers, power to restore, restorative powers. So much is lost in translating into English because of the noun verb problem. So for instance, at the University of Maine now, all of the buildings now have their names in English and in Penobscot. which is the local language of our territory. It's a Wabanaki language. And so the word for the gym is translated literally as a place where they play a lot of games. So you can see how hard it is to turn verbs into nouns and vice versa. So we have to think about psychiatric conditions, and I would propose medical conditions too, because believe it or not, medical conditions spontaneously remit as well. Andy Weil wrote about that, cultivating spontaneous remissions. And we don't want to admit it in conventional medicine that things get better without us, but they certainly do, and unpredictably so, which is why we don't want to admit it, because we can't control it. And if we can't control it, we can't market it. We can only market things that we can control. We can only market things in which we can predict the outcome, reasonably, correctly, whatever percent of the time justifies the declaration of reliability. But all things can improve without our intervention. So this is the community of voices and relationships in which we find ourselves. And there's marvelous symbolism, of course. Every tribe has somewhat different symbolism, but the importance is balance. And there's that perspective, which I think allows us to see people who suffer in psychiatry differently than the conventional paradigm. There's that perspective that we are spirit beings come to walk in a physical world. And there's widespread belief in reincarnation across Indigenous North America, but not in the way of a wheel of karma as in Asia, not in the kind of working to not have to come back, but in a way of choosing to come back, to take on something or to learn something or to get something done. And sometimes we bite off more than we can chew. Sometimes we take on so much that we collapse in the reality of it all, because we just couldn't know how hard it was going to be as spirit beings. And the process of healing is like the way the Japanese mend broken pottery with gold, that we celebrate the wounds that we have rather than stigmatize them. And the same concept exists in other nations. The Dene Nation, for instance, the Lakota Nation, there's that belief that people who get sick do it on behalf of others, that they are expressing the imbalance in the world, and that if they had not done it, then we would have had to do it. So it's therefore our obligation to help them to recover, because if not them, us. So when we think this way, then we might still use some medication, but we wouldn't expect the medication to do all the work. We wouldn't expect it to do the heavy lifting. We would expect it, as one popular psychiatric book from the 1980s described, it would make the unbearable bearable. And so the book was actually named Unbearable Affect, and it was about how we use short-term um, treatments like medication to make the unbearable bearable so that we can work on it for the long term. And we've lost that sense in psychiatry. We now think that medication is the one size fits all solution to all problems. And if we lost that, we would understand that we have to engage with the stories that people are using to live in the world. Culture being a collection of stories so that people recognize each other as having the same stories and therefore being related. So, um, so what would that lead to? It would lead to strengthening cultural identity, community integration, and political empowerment. And culture as medicine. So Christopher Lalonde found among communities in British Columbia that those communities with intact language had 55 times less suicide attempts than the general population of British Columbia. And that's all people, not just Indigenous people, but all people in British Columbia. But if the communities had lost their language, they had 50 times more suicide attempts than the general population. So language is huge. And what are some of the Indigenous thought about the causes of severe mental illness? So one is intergenerational or inherited trauma. There's second is direct trauma. Third is sort of possession by roaming spirits, hungry ghosts, like the spirit of alcoholism or the spirit of methamphetamine. A fourth is what I talked about before, being a canary in the social mine shaft, responding to the imbalance before anyone else does, having low life skills, being caught in an impossible situation, having an unmonitored, unmentored spiritual experience, or being in an impossible situation. These are some of the ways that people think severe mental illness can arrive. So what would be the healing? Well, the healing would be embedding people in a community of belonging, radical acceptance of people and the suffering that they've experienced, creating relationships that embody dignity and respect, ceremony, prayer, spirituality, contemplation of the seven virtues, body therapies like exercise, dance, music, massage, nature therapies like food, plant medicines, spending time in the forest, telling better stories, saving face, visualization, dreaming, creating a safe environment. All of these things would be part of the work if we applied Indigenous philosophy to medicine. And that would be what it would look like decolonized. So thank you for listening to this part, and we'll pause now for a break and for some discussion.